Well, what a moment this is. Here at last, we're launching an organised movement that says that people's well-being should be the goal of government, business and education. Of course, the idea isn't new at all. It goes back to the Enlightenment. I think it's the most important idea of the modern age. But here, for the first time, I think, we have a proper movement organised to push from the top down on the leaders of government, business and education to make well-being their goal, and also, of course, to show them how it can be increased. So I really think this is an idea whose time has come. Among the public, we know from surveys, huge appetite, 80% or more say well-being is more important than income. But to be honest, it's a bit discouraging what policymakers and business leaders do. They often talk the talk, but there's little walking of the walk. I think it's still true that when you come to the actual decisions that get made, the top criterion outside of health is income. That's true in government, it's true in business, it's true even in government thinking about education. And this is actually a huge mistake. So it's a mistake for politicians first, because the evidence shows that it's people's well-being more than the economy which determines how people vote. You know this probably, most of you here already. So if we take what President Clinton's aide said, it was dead wrong. It's well-being stupid. Similarly for businessmen, as has of course been said already many times, worker well-being is a key factor influencing the success of any business. But the interesting thing to me that we discovered in one of our studies was relevant to educators, that if you want to predict the success of an adult life in terms of life satisfaction from what you know about a child when they are an adolescent, it is the child's emotional health. Just 16, a simple little test, is a better predictor than all the academic record of that child. If only our educators and our politicians would take that on board. So there's a huge task of education that we're engaged in here. How can we make progress? And we've thought in organising this movement in terms of two steps. I don't mean temporally, but logically. The first is measurement. So the World Wellbeing Movement will develop and promote standard measures of worker well-being and child well-being. The measures of worker well-being will need to become key measures for measuring the social performance of a company within the ESG framework. The main S is worker well-being. And the way that a school affects the well-being of the children has got to become key information, not only for the educators themselves, for the people who run the system, the inspectors, but of course for parents when they choose the school. So measurement is number one. But number two, of course, is to know how to change the measurement without fiddling it. So the next step is to help governments, businesses and schools choose those policies which will actually increase well-being. And this requires a really detailed evidence base. The World Wellbeing Movement will channel out existing evidence. It's not a research organisation. It will channel out the evidence that's available through a stream of briefings, proactive briefings, reactive briefings if something stupid is being said in public, but a stream of briefings to the public, as well, of course, as consultancy to its member firms about how to improve well-being in the company. So just a little bit of history might be of interest. How did this movement come to happen? It originated from a meeting between myself and And Marco, this is a Zoom meeting. Marco, I thought he was steering a yacht. It looked rather good, what he was doing. He said it was a rather small boat. But it was a very intense meeting, and it was a real meeting of minds. So I had been passionate for many years about how to push governments to make well-being their goal. Marco had been equally passionate about how to have the same impact on business leaders. And we knew that this could only work on the basis of evidence, and that there had to be a secretariat, a strong secretariat, that would push out the evidence relentlessly. The obvious centre for this secretariat was precisely here, or about 500 yards away. And Jan and his centre were part of the planning of this from the beginning. We also knew that we needed, of course, strong business backing, both companies that would walk the talk, and also, of course, who would finance the operation. So Sofia, does everyone know Sofia? Oh, there you are. Sofia and Jan did an incredible amount of work. I mean, this has been nearly 2 years in the making, to create a legal organisation to recruit our founding member organisations and companies. Really astonishing achievement to have made this happen. And of course, we're absolutely thrilled to have got this incredible scale of support. So I just want to tell you who are the founding members of this organisation. I think it's pretty impressive. HSBC, Cisco, S&P Global, Victor Pinchuk Foundation, Indeed, that we've heard a lot about, BT, Unilever Walls, Fondazione CRT, MediaCom, the Energy and Resources Institute, 4-Day Week Global, McKinsey Health Institute, the Wellbeing Research Centre here, of course, and the Snam Foundation. So thank you so much to all the founding members, and especially to Jan and Sofia for making this happen. I want to... It's particularly interesting that because of his connection with S&P, Marco was able to recruit them very early on, because of course they play a crucial role in the setting of standards for ESG, and we had a rather exciting discussion over lunch as to how we can actually influence those standards in the right direction. So the movement now has a director, Sarah. Sarah, where are you? Here's Sarah. So I wanted to tell you about Sarah. She has a strong business background in worker well-being, but she's also just finished her course in a master's degree at the London School of Economics in behavioural science, including well-being. And guess what? Yesterday we heard that she was a top student. So, we're in good hands. We're off to a good start. So initially, this movement will focus on governments and business. Education will come a bit later. And we'll be consistently putting out briefings, organising meetings, insisting on the media that well-being is a goal and can be improved on an evidence-based way. And at the same time, of course, we'll be helping the founding member companies to do even better at improving the well-being of their workers. So I think this is quite an important moment in history, actually, here. Our present culture is not increasing the happiness of the world. The Gallup World Poll shows us that. So we need an organisation which campaigns for a different goal and shows how it can be achieved. So the World Wellbeing Movement is coming none too late. I think it needs a slogan. I haven't been authorized to say this, but my proposal for the slogan is, let's put well-being first. Thank you very much. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Marco Alverá. It's been such a pleasure to make contact with him and to create this jointly. Marco, when we started, was the chief executive of the Italian gas company Snam, which also Sofia works for the Snam Foundation. A few weeks ago, he decided to leave Snam and become the leader of a renewable energy venture, which we wish him all luck in. And Marco, I'd really like to ask you to come and say what we're doing, and it's lovely to have you here. Thank you. We're going to have a photograph afterwards because Marco has to leave.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Richard, so much for your kind words and the way you told our story. I'm really thrilled, honored, humbled to be here at the launch finally of our WWM. The ambition is high. We want it to become the WWF of well-being. The starting point, of course, as Richard said, is to congratulate Jan, Sofia, Sarah, and the whole team for the very hard work that brought us here. We had set with Richard that day on my little boat some what we thought were very high ambitions, but I'm pleased to say that in the last 2 years the team has really exceeded by a lot what we thought were high ambitions. We thought we were going to be able to gather a few founding members and start the movement to then make it grow to maybe a dozen members, and to be here today starting this with 14 of the world leading companies representing over 500,000 employees is just something that's very, very exciting. Well-being has been around forever in the circles of philosophy, but people, and Jan can tell us all about Aristotle and how it's the purpose of life since people really started thinking about life. But people like Friedman made sure it was kind of kept out of business for a long period of time. And thankfully, that's all changing, and it's changing fast. It's changing in the UN with the SDGs. It's really changing in companies, and you have here 14 companies that are really at the cutting edge of people who care, but there's a lot more companies out there, and the group is growing. The reason why the well-being is becoming so central in business and so crucial for good business, there's really 3 reasons, I think. The first is that in a post-pandemic world, employees simply won't show up if they don't feel good about it. People want purpose and people want well-being, and there's a lot of data to back this up. But for companies, it's really hard to recruit and retain people unless they feel good about coming to work. The second reason is that when people feel good, they just perform a lot better. So it's just really, really good for business. The team in a fair environment outperforms teams that are where people just don't feel well, and that teams where well-being is low just really, really underperform, even in the same company. Teams where well-being is high. And finally, the whole ESG, and the ESG may evolve and names may change, but the concept that we have to measure stuff that's not just financial is here to stay. It's here to stay, and we see this in S&P, of course. The trillions and trillions of dollars of passive investment is increasing every week. And a passive investor means he's no longer meeting Alan or myself and going into depth. He's investing in indices. And indices are built using standards. And so the standard becomes, in the future, the stock picker. And so it's really important for companies to perform well across the 3 dimensions of E, S, and G. Now, E and G are quite easy to measure because we know we have to get to net zero, and there's a lot of law firms out there and Glass-Lewis and people telling us what good governance looks like. But they're incredibly expensive to enact and may require new technologies. When it comes to the S, it's really hard to measure it But it's not that expensive to ask someone how she is feeling. So that's all we need to do, is to standardize that question. Jan has 4 magic questions instead of 1. It could be 7, it could be 8, but we just need to get companies to understand the power of asking people and tracking the answer of how someone is feeling. The reason we started this, and I don't want to repeat what Richard said, but I really think that companies, the word company comes from Latin, cum panis. A company is a place where people come together to eat bread. That's what we need to go back to. A workplace has to be a place where people want to go, want to engage, they have a sense of purpose. And companies right now, and I think finding vaccines in record time helped in a way, and maybe the not so brilliant behaviors of some of the politics in some countries, companies are now really trusted. So companies can move fast, and if they move together, they can move even faster, and companies can play a role. And that's exactly the philosophy with which we have set this up. The goals are threefold. The first, as I said, is to come up with the academic, best detailed research to come up with these standards, with these 4 questions. And if it's 5, it's 5. If it's 3, it's 3. This measure should become a key element of how company managers are remunerated. It should be a key KPI in their performance scorecard. The second objective is to make this group of 14 institutions grow and to share among, and we started today, we had our first board meeting, to share our best practices, and that's already impacting a hell of a lot of employees, and the outreach that each of these companies and groups can have is just huge. And the third, as Richard alluded to, is to bring this and export this back to civil society. Because if we want a CEO's pay to be measured on the well-being of his people in the company, the same should apply to schools, to hospitals, to gyms, to municipalities, cities, and indeed to governments with the whole kind of beyond GDP measurement effort. So what we felt when we started was that there wasn't enough light shed on well-being. And when you're in a cavern, just lighting a candle makes a hell of a difference. So we started this really with the idea of taking out some flashlights and shedding more light on well-being. But today, here in Oxford, we have 14 world-leading organizations that have showed up with their massive headlights at full beam. So the road is long, but I think that hopefully it will be easier to find the way. So I really look forward to working with a lot of you to achieve this. Thank you very much.
We've got an esteemed panel today and not a lot of time, so I'm just going to get straight to it. But to pick up on what you were saying, we're going to talk about not only talking the talk, but walking the walk, and actually what businesses can do in practice, some of the opportunities, some of the challenges around implementing well-being in business decisions. So I'm very quickly going to introduce our panelists before I start. We've got Alan Jope, the CEO of Unilever. Next to him, Josh Krichefski, the EMEA CEO and Global COO of MediaCom. Sofia Maroudia, who we've heard a lot of, Director of ESG at Snam, the Snam Foundation. LaFawn Davis, Senior Vice President of ESG at Indeed. Martin Dewhurst, Senior Partner from McKinsey. And Manjit, who's Global Head of ESG Research and Data from S&P Global. So you can see quite the lineup and plenty to discuss. Alan, I'm just going to kick off with you, if I may. Unilever is a company that has actually become renowned for doing good by corporate social responsibility and actually paying considerate amount of attention to ESG matters. How do you think of well-being within the general context of ESG?
Oh, well, hi, thanks for having us. I'll skip all the pleasantries, we're short of time. Look, Unilever, we're a large consumer products company. I don't want to assume everybody knows about Unilever. We're present in 190 countries and 3.4 billion people use our products, so about almost half of humanity. And we like to hope that we're helping make their lives a little bit better every day. And we find ourselves in a bad context. You know, the world is full of crisis. I don't need to go on about that, but the biggest ones we believe are the climate emergency, the loss of nature and biodiversity, and growing inequality. And we really feel that business can be part of solving these huge problems, working across with other sectors. And we have kind of a simple model of how we try and make change on important issues. And I could use gender, I could use climate, but if we take well-being, there's 4 layers to the model. It's like an onion. It starts with getting our own house in order, then we think about our value chain, then we think what we can do with our brands, and then we think about advocacy more widely. So if you take well-being, of course, we have progressive health and well-being policies. We do also measure well-being amongst our employees. We have been asking for several years now, Unilever cares about my well-being, and the latest score for that is that 85% of our people feel that we do, and that's up 12 percentage points versus pre-pandemic. So we've had quite a good pandemic in terms of people feeling that we care about their well-being. But we can't really do much unless we get our own house in order. Then we think about our value chain, and I'll use ice cream as an example, where we've now worked with 60,000 vanilla farmers in Madagascar to make sure that they earn a fair living wage and are able to house, clothe, feed and educate their families. And in doing so, we think we're making a small contribution to the well-being of people in our value chain. And that takes our reach from 150,000 employees to millions of people. Then the next thing we can do is with our brands. And we're famous for brands like Dove championing girls' self-esteem, or Lifebuoy on hand washing, but our brand Walls has made it their purpose to campaign for happiness. And you can see there's quite a tight link between a happy moment of having an ice cream and campaigning for happiness. And then the last, of course, is our advocacy. And that's why we get involved in these type of activities, to bring sectors together, put our shoulder to what we think are important tasks. And that model's worked for us quite well. And now, just to wrap up, we're moving into a world now where this idea that companies have to do some good is being widely embraced. Governments demand it, regulators demand it, our customers and consumers demand it, and as Marco said, employees will not join a company unless they're clear how they're contributing. The next step is standardizing the reporting and measurement of, let's start with an easy one, well-being within our own companies. Thank you.
I was going to move on, but actually I'm going to put my journalist cap on for just a very short minute. And one thing that occurred to me while I was listening to the previous presentations is what's been happening right now. So talking about actual well-being in practice, there is a cost of living crisis going on, and it's everywhere. It's not just in the UK, but Europe, US, high inflation levels. What can businesses do in that environment to continue to pay some heed towards well-being, but at the same time, accept that in some cases, all employees need may actually be just a pay rise?
I think nobody in this room, except Richard, has worked in a period of high global inflation. Sorry, Richard. So we're all on new ground. But Unilever's used to it, because in our businesses in Brazil and Argentina and Turkey and Indonesia, we know what it's like working in periods of high inflation, and it's a blight. Wages cannot keep up. And so what inflation does is it erodes standards of living. So in our bi-weekly global town hall meetings last week, the number one question to me was, are our wages going to keep up with inflation? I said, no, they're not. But what we can do is make sure that those people who are most exposed are protected. So Unilever, of course, we pay a fair living wage to all of our employees, but we've also made a commitment that by 2030, everyone in Unilever's value chain will be paid a fair living wage, or they will not be doing business with Unilever. And that extends our reach from hundreds of thousands to millions, and we've asked many other companies to join in on that. So I don't think we can protect the lifestyles of the affluent, but we can protect the minimum standards that we offer to those who are most at risk because of inflation.
Thank you for the very clear answer. Josh, I'd like to move to you now. I understand that you've done quite a bit of work with not just companies, but also with the government, or whatever government we have right now in the UK, about placing well-being, again, at the heart of decision-making, but also making it somewhat mandatory in assessing outcomes and looking at say, overall GDP levels for the economy.
What I'm starting really is a campaign for a new era of mental health in business. And it's with the UK government, so that's who we're lobbying to. And it's actually evolved this. So it started with just focusing on measurement, which I will talk about in a minute, but it really is encompassing a little bit more than that. And I'm having conversations with CEOs of big companies. You know, I asked Alan what his view on it was earlier over lunch. And what I really want is for there to be annually a CEO statement that the government regulates that this happens, that the CEO of companies over 500 people make a statement that they are committed to mental health in their company. And incorporated within that are kind of 4 key areas. First of all, that there is somebody on the ExCo who is accountable for the mental health policy in that company. Secondly, that there is kind of credible training for people of all levels within the business around mental health and well-being. Thirdly, that there is services provided, both preventative and remediary services for employees and contractors in that company around mental health. And fourth, to your point about outcomes, actual risk assessment and management around kind of doing pulse surveys throughout the year that are standardized and anonymized for people to actually give information about their mental health. And Marco talked earlier about Jan's 4 questions. And I think the things that Jan thinks about or talks about, sorry to put words in your mouth here, about kind of sentiment output. So how stressful is your work for you? How do you have a sense of purpose at work? And so what I want is to introduce, and really for government to mandate, for companies to do those sorts of surveys, not to report the data externally of those surveys, but to share the findings back to the people in their companies, so that they're having an open conversation about what's good and what's not good, and where work needs to happen, and to focus in on kind of where things are positive as well, and try and expand on those things as well. So that's really the focus that I'm working on with government. I'm at the beginning of a journey, but I feel really passionately about it. I mean, we've been measuring our people for about 7 years now at MediaCom, and I think it's a really important thing to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Sofia, so we've heard a lot about your role in organizing today and getting everyone together. So thank you very much on behalf of everyone here today. I do want to ask you though, because you are the head of ESG at Snam, and for those who don't know Snam, it's one of the largest energy infrastructure companies in the world. And I mean, it's interesting for me because this is also, again, wearing my journalist cap, it's coming at a time where energy prices are very high, there's a gas squeeze going on, cost of living crisis, etc. One perhaps could argue that maybe this isn't the right time to be thinking about ESG considerations because you're coming from an energy infrastructure background. So why is ESG so important to Snam and to you?
Sure. So first of all, Richard was very kind, but none of this would have been done without the team. So Valerio, Carolina, Roberta and Matteo, and of course Laura from the Oxford team that I can't see, but she's sure somewhere here. There you go. So so that really made the difference. So look, if you think about ESG, an energy company, you can talk about something that in the energy sector we call the energy trilemma. So essentially we talk about energy security, getting enough energy into our industries and into our homes. We talk about having clean energy, and we talk about energy at accessible prices. So first of all, as you can imagine, today is not a good time for the energy trilemma, right? I mean, energy security is at risk given the war. Green energy, we're on the way, but we all know that we have a lot yet to do. And prices are going up, so we have a cost of living crisis, as you said, and that starts really from if we can heat our homes and if we can run our run our cars and all of that. So actually, without ESG, energy companies cannot survive. It's what they have to focus on. Of course, the ones who do it well are more competitive, talking to Marco's point about the stocks that are chosen. Our investors increasingly ask us about ESG. We have more and more ESG investors every year. We've gone from 20 to 40 to 70 in 3 years. And they're very, very, very focused. And of course, they've been very focused on the E, on the carbon reduction for many years, but they are starting to talk about the S. And we can't look at the world in silos. It's not about environment or people. It's about people prospering in a healthy environment, right? So it's very key to what we do.
And just well-being, how does it fit into that as well? You mentioned the E.
So well-being is very much at the center of the S. Very much like Alan said, we think about the S as our employees first, then our supply chain, and then the communities in which we work within. And at the center of all of this is our people. So how do we measure if we're serving them well? Through well-being, and it's really a very, very efficient and effective way to ensure that we're serving them properly. And as Marco said, it's very difficult to bring down emissions. It's very expensive. We don't have all the technology. It's not that difficult to increase well-being. I mean, Jan has all the answers. The WWM will come out with the playbook. So, all the companies should adopt the WWM playbook that Sarah will put together. It's really not that difficult, and it's not expensive either. So it's an easy one.
LaFawn, putting the same question to you. Why is well-being, you think, at the heart of the S in ESG, and how would you go about defining it if you had to do so yourself?
So for Indeed, our S actually stands for society. Before we started the efforts for ESG, we wanted to see kind of what other companies were doing and how they were defining social, because as all of my colleagues have said, and everyone at the conference, the E is pretty well defined. The G is pretty well defined. It's the S that's a little bit murky. So lots of companies do it very differently. So for us, we wanted to make sure that we weren't focusing within just to make ourselves a better company, that we wanted to impact the world. And so part of our goals are to help 30 million job seekers facing barriers get hired, barriers to entry into the job market, the bias that they may face. We also want to cut the time it takes to search for a job by 50%, because what we know from OECD data is that 40% of households will slip under the poverty line if they forego income for 3 months. And so if we can cut that time in half before they get income, then we're keeping people out of poverty. And the last one that we have is to make sure we're establishing a standard for work happiness. So not only our mission is we help people get jobs, so not only do we want to help people get jobs, but for them to be happy when they get there. And so for us, employee happiness and well-being is core to how we're defining the S. And we would like other companies to do the same. The future of work conversation cannot happen without employee well-being being at the center of that. And so that's why we joined the World Wellbeing Movement, because we want to make sure that we're part of the conversation with these great companies, that we can push this globally and actually make transformative impact for society.
Martin, Marco talked about the Milton Friedman-esque philosophy of maximizing profits and how we've actually come a long way since then. In your view, why do you think businesses and companies have started changing the way they think about their businesses and are really paying a lot more respect to ESG considerations? Is it because there has been external pressure, or is there just a general understanding that in order to be a successful company in the long run, you also have to do well by your community and well by the environment?
First of all, it's just a little bit of positioning. I'm actually a senior partner at McKinsey, so I serve clients, but I'm also, together with colleagues in the room, one of the co-founders and leaders of the McKinsey Health Institute, which, just for clarity, is a non-profit generating part of McKinsey creating public good. That's hence why we're joining this movement. And that's based also on a fundamental belief that health is actually significantly broader than physical health. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of our sort of foundational thoughts is that, society in general, before we move to business, needs to define health not only physical, but of course mental, which has been neglected, also social, also spiritual health. And by the latter, we mean not necessarily formal religious belief, but a sense of purpose in what we do. So one of our foundational beliefs is that we need to kind of expand that conversation so that people define their own well-being much more broadly than has historically been the case. And therefore, within that, one of the areas where we're focusing on is employee mental health and well-being. Because, of course, one of the areas where we believe we can add to the conversation is the incredible reach and presence we have within the private sector, as well as the sort of social and public. So within that, I think what we've seen over time, and some of our recent research shows, is that the vast majority of companies actually do now care. I mean, I think when we looked at it last, it's something like 95% of companies have some form of mental or personal support to their employees. So I think the intent is there, and frankly, if you look back to the companies that have been around for hundreds of years, whether it's the Unilevers, whether it's the Shells, or whatever, it's always been through an enlightened sense that doing the right thing by your employees will lead to sustained performance. There's no surprise in that insight. It's just now, I think people are seeing the sort of much more immediately, how critical it is. And indeed, one of the things we're, even from our pure consulting work now, we're defining what we call the holistic impact with our clients. Because we realize that, perhaps over certainly when I started 30 years ago, it would be around operational performance. That would be the conversation you'd have with your client. That would be the way you would develop, you would define your impact. Where now clients are demanding, and we're also kind of encouraging a conversation that says, actually, it's about the capabilities you build, the impact you have on your employees, the social impact of the work you're doing. So I think actually companies are embracing the sort of a much more holistic definition of what it means to be a good and responsible and caring employer. Now, of course, within that, there's then the whole thing. Why isn't it happening? Why do we see some of the levels of stress and burnout, etc., that our research has demonstrated? And I think it's primarily because the actual solutions, I think, again, as some of our recent research shows, are much more systemic than individual. I think one of the phrases we use in our recent article is, you can't yoga your way to success. Just offering people classes and supports and coaching, is good, but actually compared with giving them a daily experience of their work, where they're not stigmatized, they feel included, they can see a path to personal growth. They feel that it's not a toxic environment, that they're respected in it when they share their opinion. These are the things that ultimately make the biggest difference. So one of the things we want to work with others to do is to say, if we have actually got a lot more consensus around why this is genuinely important, how can we begin to work in everything we do, not just as a special effort, but in everything we do to improve that sense of belonging and well-being, within an institution. But I do think companies are, certainly the companies, our clients are embracing it very strongly.
And it certainly also seems like mental health is a very common theme here when it comes to well-being, overall well-being. Well, last but not least, we've talked a lot about the definition of well-being, why it's important, but I guess one of the more interesting and complicated elements is how you go about standardizing it all. And that's where a rating agency would come into play. Marco as well earlier was saying that it's quite easy to assess, say, carbon emissions, or to evaluate the E or the G to look at the composition of a board, but when it comes to S, there's a lot more variability. So, how do you even start approaching the standardization of something as broad as well-being?
Well, I'll start by saying that actually after hearing all the conversations over the last 2 days, it seems like there is a very simple way to start this by asking a very simple question, which in the last decade or so that I've been trying to design ESG metrics, having conversations around standardization, seems to be this impossible task, because you're trying to approach these very complicated topics with horribly complicated metrics that no one can agree on. So somehow it's refreshing to hear that actually maybe there's a very simple way of asking something very basic. I think if you look at ESG reporting and how it's evolved today, companies have spent an incredible amount of resources scrambling to get the right metrics, and Alan will know this, and others will know this. Each year to satisfy this kind of growing need for more data, more information, and at the same time, metrics have been kind of going all over the place. There isn't enough standardization. So certainly having something that is simple, people can agree on, and it's easy to actually implement and then act on. I think that's key here, because on the S side of things, at least, we've always faced a lot of resistance. To give a very concrete example, we introduced new metrics around diversity and minority groups last year in this annual survey that we do that feeds into our ESG scores. And the immediate reaction by companies in certain countries, well, no, we can't even touch this because regulation says we're not allowed to ask these questions. Well, there are ways of getting that information. There are ways of having the conversation, and somehow hiding behind the fact that, these are things that by law we're not allowed to ask, they're sensitive, makes it very difficult. And I think that for a lot of these S metrics has made it difficult on a global scale for very large companies to try to tackle these things. And it's easier just to say, well, we'll not measure it at all, than actually trying to start somewhere. So that's been, I think, the experience with the S metrics, not because they're difficult to measure, but because it's about culture, it's about feelings, it's very sensitive to some way.
So essentially you're going to ask, it would be the same set of questions to all companies worldwide to ensure there's an industry standard.
I think you almost have to, because because it is well-being, which is inherently more subjective than your race or your ethnicity, which can be sensitive in certain countries. I think that's important. And just to finish, what Alan said before, I think is so important. If you think about, our companies, or here in Europe or in the US, and your immediate workforce, that's one thing. But if you think about your value chains as a company and your employees in different parts of the world, we're struggling with things like, do companies measure a living wage? And Unilever is one of those few companies that is actually doing this. 4% of the 12,000 companies we assess have some public statement mentioning a living or fair wage. 4%, that's not very big. And an additional 5% of companies tell us internally they haven't put it on their website yet, but they tell us we're working on it. And of those, a very small percentage actually have a methodology to measure this. So, until you've kind of sorted that question out, like, are you paying people fairly everywhere in the world and in your value chains, kind of measuring well-being is also kind of difficult. So,
we've discussed a lot of things, but Alan, I want to go back to, I guess the double curse of being the CEO of such a big company, which is, on one hand, you can actually enact changes and come up with a strategy that's good for the world, for the community, for society. But on the other hand, you are always going to have shareholders on your back. And we're all sitting here and we're a group of like-minded individuals, and we all believe in what we're talking about today, which is that well-being is very important. But unfortunately, there are some shareholders who want to go by a 3-month playbook, and they want to see maximization of profits. And some people out there, I'm not agreeing with this, but some people out there think that there is a trade-off between taking ESG matters into consideration and maximizing profits for the company. How do you deal with that external pressure? And what do you say to people who think that there is a trade-off between the two?
That there isn't. This is the most dangerous false assumption, that doing business in a responsible fashion compromises shareholder returns. It's absolute nonsense. Just the opposite, in fact. We believe that, it's a bit slogany, but brands with purpose grow, companies with purpose last, and people with purpose thrive. And we're building quite a strong data set of evidence. Our purpose-driven brands are growing 6 times faster than the rest of our portfolio. Sustainable sourcing has saved us 1.2 billion euros of cost. Being a sustainable business takes risk down, and good luck attracting the best talent if you don't have clarity on sustainability. So I think the business case is becoming absolutely compelling. I'll also tell you that, yes, we do get the occasional shareholder who says, you guys are falling asleep at the wheel, you're woke. Well, they can go and invest somewhere else. But let me tell you, BlackRock come to us to talk about how do we drive carbon responsibility into more of our portfolio.
Right.
L&G came to us and gave me a right grilling about nutritional standards of our foods portfolio.
Right.
We have other major shareholders want to know more about fair living wage. So the normal conversation that I have with shareholders is go further, We have an activist just joined our board. Nelson Peltz from Tryon, one of these feared activists.
Yeah.
When I first met with him, he said, and one of our suspicions that you could do a better job is that you're not going as fast as you could on your ESG commitments. How about that?
Yeah.
And then I see we've got Dexter still in the room from Blue Zone. I'd never heard of Blue Zone, but while you were speaking on the last panel, I went and investigated what were the magic 9 criteria of these 5 societies that have got people who live long and happy lives. And one of the 9 is wine at 5, right? Okay. So if that's not a reason to look up and be happy and confident, I don't know what is. Good stuff.
Is that a strong hint that there's going to be wine at 5? Okay. All right. I am a bit conscious of time, but I want to ask a question maybe to Josh and to LaFawn quickly before we go back to Sofia about how the pandemic, you think, has changed things. Josh, for you, there is a room of thought out there that says the pandemic obviously was very challenging in many respects, but also extremely challenging when it comes to things like mental health. Do you think it has pushed forward the ESG agenda or set it back?
Well, I mean, I think the positive side, one of the very few positive sides of the pandemic was that it's escalated the conversation around mental health and well-being at a leadership level. And I think that's great. But I think it's escalated it because of the real negative impacts of the pandemic on those areas. Mm-hmm. My worry, and really at the heart of why I'm doing the campaign that I was talking about before, is that not enough leaders who are necessarily as enlightened as the one we've just heard from go back to worrying more about the bottom line and not thinking more holistically about the impact of all of these areas. And Alan made the point very well that they are not contradicting, they're not conflicting things. And actually, most of us run companies where people are the most important thing. So they should be the most important thought that we're having when we're running the companies. But that's my concern, and that's why I think it's really important to focus in on it and to keep that momentum going.
Well, LaFawn, I guess let me just twist the question a little bit, because we haven't really touched on this, but also pandemic shows that the hardest hit population from the pandemic were lower income and also women of childbearing age. Mm-hmm. So how is that factored into how you're thinking about well-being?
Yeah, so I think what we learned from the data that we collected and the great study that George and Jan ran was kind of pre-pandemic and then pandemic, and I don't think we're quite post yet, but we will be able to measure that as we started to collect data actually towards the end of 2019. And we did start to see those differences. One, people are looking for that sense of belonging. People are looking to, yes, get paid fairly, but also they want to have trust and belonging and flexibility and all these other things in the workforce. They're demanding this change of companies, and you've all heard of the Great Resignation, the Great Realization, the Great Reevaluation. There's all of these great times, and specifically for women and minorities who were hit hardest during COVID, and essential workers and things like that. What we're finding is the need is different. Wanting to have a sense of well-being, a sense of happiness in the workplace doesn't go away because you're lower income. The demand is still there. And so I think what I'm really looking forward to in the data that we have is further research on those demographics. So Indeed just started to collect demographic data not too long ago for job seekers so that we can understand who people are. We understand that there are issues out there and things that are hitting people differently, but really being able to identify those barriers to entry and what people need is where the focus is when we talk about well-being.
Sofia, I want to ask you what you think the biggest challenge is to the launch and the adoption of something like the Wellbeing Movement.
I think the biggest challenge is going to be getting companies on board without them fearing that they're going to be named and shamed or outed, to be honest. I think, again, here we're lots of like-minded people, a lot of research, and, we're all of the same view. But along this journey, we did talk to other companies, and it's not that all our companies have great employee climate surveys, right? And I think what we need to do is face up to that and use each other to say, how do I work on it, right? It's not about getting the highest score, but about recognizing what your score is. And so I think that is a bit the challenge, just like some companies are not reporting on other things, that there is a bit of a fear. But I think it's our job to make sure.
It's interesting that you say that. Companies might be worried about the backlash of joining something like the Wellbeing. It only defeats the purpose. And you would think that it's actually easier to sort of, say the right things, but not necessarily do it or enact it in practice. That's something obviously that's been going on in the E side of the equation. There's unfortunately been quite a lot of greenwashing that's taken place in the last couple of years that hasn't been the best for the industry. So what is it in your view that would hinder companies from signing up to something like this when in reality, all they're saying is we're just trying to maximize our employees' happiness?
Yeah, no, I think it's just adding that reporting standard, so to speak, right? Just like they're not reporting on other things that Manjit mentioned, for example. So, but I do think that it's totally surmountable. It's about us as a group of people explaining that that's what it's not about. It's not about who is the coolest person or woman in the room. It's about getting it better. But it is a very important issue, and as Alan was saying, people will not join companies that don't have good employee scores. And even in Italy, for example, where Glassdoor wasn't so big, I've used it personally, and I've seen people use it increasingly. So these things will become more important, even in economies where perhaps they've been less low key. But so I think it's totally surmountable, but something to keep in mind.
Because it's a competitive advantage.
Yeah, totally.
Right? So
totally.
you're going to get more applicants, you're going to get more job seekers who want to work for your company, and you're going to be able to retain your employees more, which has a cost. So I think that's the fear, is that if it is shown that a company doesn't have happy employees, that the employees are going to go someplace else.
Martin, how do you work on the scalability challenge in your view?
Yeah, I think that is actually, to my mind, the biggest single challenge. I think there are some precepts. I think one is to ensure that the small number of companies that haven't yet embraced it do fully understand that this, as Alan said, there is no trade-off between doing the right thing by your employees, creating well-being and long-term performance. So I think there is still a little bit of an education and a communication challenge. I think the second one, it's not just because I'm a management consultant, but I do think having the right data is critical. We talked a lot earlier about having the right evidence, the right data, because I do think it's one of the areas where you need a sort of a stronger and stronger foundation. And then around that, you can then get the right standards, you can get the right transparency. And I think those are the things that begin to create then that virtuous cycle. I think, frankly, the biggest challenge beyond those in terms of adoption is just simply, senior leadership bandwidth. I mean, as you pointed out at the moment, the people are looking after employees in Russia and the Ukraine, or there's supply chains, there's inflation, there's energy, there's a workforce that in most cases was barely recovering from the worst stages of the pandemic before they're being hit with another wall of anxiety and another wall of challenge. And so if you're kind of just the mind, how many things can I embrace at the same time? And I think it's really just, the movement, to be fair, is only launched today. So we might give it a bit more time before evaluating. So I do think, therefore, there's that's the key thing, is to actually begin to put this more central to their agenda, so they see it's important as well as urgent.
All right, Manjit, everything we've discussed is culminating to this question. Are we going to get an index for well-being out of S&P?
I won't speak to kind of, my colleagues in our business sector, product launches, but I will say I think the movement to focusing more on impact on the world, on measuring real kind of outcomes. I think a lot of talk around SDG alignment. This is something obviously that isn't new, but there is increasing investor interest in those types of products. And so certainly I think it's not unimaginable that, an index that incorporates things like, real impacts on the environment or real impacts on, human health and society and positive outcomes. I think absolutely.
Just one final very quick follow-up question. Do you take supply chain into consideration when formulating these standards?
I think you have to look at supply chain depending on the sector. It's important everywhere, but in some sectors it's certainly
more
much
important
more
than others.
important.
Right.
And if you don't take that into account, then, or for example, in the financial sector that I work in, if you exclude where, banks and financial institutions are making their investments from that kind of value chain perspective, then you're only focusing on their little, operational footprint, then you're missing a big chunk of their real world impact.
Well, I could keep going because this is what I do for a living. I can go around again, but I am going to wrap it up here. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. I also just want to say one more thing. We're going to take a photo with the rest of the founding members. Anyone who's here, if you could come up on stage, and I believe everyone else can go for refreshment, but not yet that 5 o'clock wine. Is it wine time? No, it's not wine o'clock. So if you could come up for a photo. Thank you.